Hey, everybody, welcome back to another episode of The Infirmary, where, as always, it is my job to help debunk myths in the endurance world and help you stay healthier and in the game for longer. Okay, today we are talking about a really important topic around this time of year. And if you watched our last episode where we talked to Cody Beals and his pathological inability to rest, which obviously is not a good thing, because if you listen to that episode, you heard about all of the things that Cody has gone through since realizing that he had kind of trained himself into a very deep hole over the past 2 years, but really his entire career. And so today we are going to talk about the differences between proper training, which you might call functional overreaching, under recovery, which is called non-functional overreaching, and overtraining, which is called overtraining syndrome, which is a very serious diagnosis, one that can sometimes take months or even years to recover from. And so, yeah, I'm bringing this in at the end of the year to hopefully do some scare tactics to help you, if you're an athlete or if you're a coach who's responsible for athletes, to keep yourself and your athletes healthy and in the game for the long term. Because as we all know, consistency is the thing that is going to make you the best athlete you could possibly be. And if you have to take long months or years breaks from training, that consistency is going to be deeply impaired. Not setting aside the fact that also overtraining syndrome leads to really negative physical and mental health outcomes. And so not only is your performance going to be impaired, but your happiness and your health is also going to be impaired. So, yeah, let's get into it. If you hang out with triathletes and endurance athletes for a long enough time, you may realize that they have a little bit of a penchant for maybe being slightly over dramatic. And you hear a lot of the time athletes saying that they're overtrained. And I think this is similar to athletes saying that they have pulled a muscle when in more likelihood they have probably strained a muscle. A pull is a very serious injury, one that is definitely going to require treatment and probably some extended rest, because what's going on is the muscle tissue is actually like separating from the ligaments and tendons that then attach to bones. That's obviously really bad. A strain, on the other hand, is, some micro trauma that has sort of gotten to perhaps the mesotrauma level. We're not talking macro trauma, which is obviously big, but a strain is usually something that you can manage through proper treatment and probably doesn't even require you to stop training. That's not a perfect analogy because non-functional overreaching, what I call under recovery, does require rest in order to come back, but it's not nearly as serious as overtraining syndrome or, in this particular analogy, a pulled muscle. But on the other hand, again, non-functional overreaching is a precursor, we think, to overtraining syndrome. So in the same way that if you had a few muscle strains in the same area, just continuing to train at your normal level is probably going to result in something worse later on. So we do want to make the distinction between overtraining and under recovery. But if you are under recovered, you might be on your way to overtraining syndrome. Okay. So the goal of today, you're going to learn what overtraining syndrome is in the first place, how it's different from non-functional overreaching, which we're going to call NFO from now on, and how both of those are different from functional overreaching, which is what we would probably just call proper training. So OTS in the literature is described as extremely rare, and it's important to remember that. Just like we just talked about the fact that it's less likely that you have pulled a muscle when you've more likely strained a muscle. But one of the other things we have to account for here is that OTS is probably also underreported. Just think about the athletes that you know that usually kind of just keep training no matter what. They might be overtrained and just not going to a doctor or talking to their coach. So I hope that after this episode, you're going to be worried enough that you're going to take overtraining syndrome seriously, and you'll take some steps to insulate yourself from it. Because in some of these cases, and we're going to get into some case studies today, you are going to be really alarmed at how long overtraining syndrome can take to recover from. In one particular case, it's a 4-year recovery pattern. That's a lot. So I'm really hopeful that this episode is going to allow you to stay in your sport at your desired level of performance for a longer period of time. Okay, let's define our terms. Always important when we are talking about things like this. And this episode might get a little hairy in terms of like science and chemistry and stuff like that. We'll do our best. So, functional overreaching, non functional overreaching, and overtraining syndrome. Let's get into that. So, functional overreaching, which we're just going to abbreviate to FO for the rest of this episode, is a healthy, positive state of training where the athlete does a little bit more than what they are capable of or what they did in the previous training block, and then allowing for periods of rest, which leads to what we call supercompensation, where at first there's a decrement in performance, but then after rest, the athlete is stronger than they were before. So athletes build fatigue, but it's manageable and it's necessary for the right amount of overreach. If you want to get into this quite a bit more, then, go ahead and have a listen to our episode on progressive overload, which really goes in deep onto what proper training looks like. Non-functional overreaching, which we're going to abbreviate as NFO, and what I call under recovery, in order to differentiate from, are you overtrained or under recovered? So this is just functional overreaching that continues for too long without a break. You're going to see some of the symptoms of overtraining syndrome, which we're going to get in later. But the key difference is that once you do start seeing those symptoms showing up, you or your coach are like, ooh, red flags, let's take a rest. And those symptoms will resolve after 21 days of rest. Sometimes it goes on a little longer, but it's a shorter term recovery period. Still, this is not awesome because if you have to rest for 14 to 21 days, that's probably too much rest from, what you were doing before. And you're probably going to start your next block at a lower level of fitness than you began that last block. So this is suboptimal because we want our fitness to sort of climb and then rest and climb and then rest. And in this case, too much stimulus, athlete gets too tired, they have to rest for too long, training becomes inconsistent. Okay, overtraining syndrome, or what we call OTS. Here's a gnarly one. Here's a fun definition. A maladapted response to excessive exercise without rest, resulting in perturbations of multiple body systems, neurologic, endocrinologic, immunologic, coupled with mood changes and depression. Recovery is months to years, often marked by a repeated inability to recognize the symptoms and back off before it's too late. This is really bad. Perturbations of multiple body systems, neurologic, endocrinologic, and immunologic. Even if you don't speak science, yeah, that's a problem. Brain and nervous system impairments, endocrine and hormonal impairments, that's really problematic and is going to mess with your body in long-term and very damaging ways. And obviously immunologic, that's your immune system. If that is impaired, you can contract hosts of really bad conditions. The one that we see most of the time with overtraining syndrome are upper respiratory infections, or URIs. And we're going to come back to those quite a bit in the rest of this episode. So I hope that you can hear just from our definition of our terms that we want functional overreaching. We don't want non-functional overreaching. And non-functional overreaching is a step on the path to overtraining syndrome, which is really bad and can take us out of the sport entirely. So I hope I've terrified you enough here in this introduction. And now we're going to get into how this arrives and appears in our bodies, some case studies, and then, of course, what we can actually do about it. So stick around. Okay, next we're going to talk about how overtraining syndrome actually happens. And this one can get a little kind of gnarly, and we're definitely going to get in the weeds in terms of science and everything like that. So if you don't want to go through all of that, or if you're just like, I just want to hear about the horror stories and how to fix it, then you can probably jump down about 10 minutes and you're going to be able to pick up from where we left off, or just grab one of the other chapters in the down belows here. So this is from an excellent meta-analysis that came out in Sport Health in 2012. The authors were Jeffrey Creher and Jennifer Schwartz. I don't know if I'm getting Creher correct, Creher. If you are watching, please reach out and let me know. So we're going to go through 6 or 7 different possible hypotheses about how we end up in overtraining syndrome. So remember, hypotheses are simply educated guesses that then we need to prove in order for them to become theory. So these are the different things that particular study authors have tested out in the pursuit of trying to figure out what causes overtraining syndrome. Okay, the first one is glycogen depletion. And so the hypothesis here is that, when you don't have enough glycogen in your muscles, that causes fatigue and decreased performance. So what are the strengths of this hypothesis? So we can definitely correlate decreased glycogen with decreased performance and exercise-induced fatigue. So maybe this is one of the things that then leads us into overtraining syndrome. Unfortunately, we see in all of these studies that there is no connection in the literature between low glycogen and overtraining syndrome. We see athletes with normal glycogen levels still getting overtrained. And then the other problem with this one is that it doesn't account for all symptoms, which is something you're going to hear as a thread as we go through all of these hypotheses. One thing when you're sort of like working through hypotheses that are in scientific papers and whatnot, you can usually suss out what in the English world we would call tone, which is the author's attitude towards his or her subject material. And in this particular case, you can definitely put your finger on what you think these particular authors who are doing the meta-analysis of all these other studies, what they think. Next up, central fatigue. Okay, again, stick with me here. So increased tryptophan, you all know tryptophan. It's the amino acid that we, ingest a lot of around Thanksgiving, and it makes us sleepy. So tryptophan is a precursor to serotonin, which you might think, hey, wait, serotonin is a good thing, right? It helps my mental health stay positive. I know that when people have low serotonin, that's usually when they're on their way to depression. Yeah, we do need serotonin, but in the terms of exercising, too much serotonin can impair performance. And we actually see this with athletes who are taking SSRIs for depression or whatnot, that they may exhibit decreased performance. So the long and the short of it here is that if there's too much tryptophan, there's too much 5-HT, so there might be too much serotonin, which could lead to decreased performance, which could be the reason why we end up overtrained. One of the things, though, is we see that well-trained athletes are usually less sensitive to 5-HT. And so one of the hypotheses here is maybe in athletes that are overtrained, that positive adaptation goes away. And we've seen that in marathon runners, if we give them amino acid supplementation, which is what tryptophan is, there might be decreased 5-HT synthesis, which might lead to better performances because less serotonin. Because remember, we're going tryptophan, 5-HT, serotonin. This is wildly oversimplified. It's good enough. Weaknesses. No studies that measure 5-HT directly. So we're totally in this world of inference. Also, mood changes are very subjective and they're difficult to standardize. And once again, this hypothesis does not account for all of the symptoms of OTS. So it's incomplete. Okay, next up, glutamine. So glutamine, again, we're in amino acid territory. Pretty quickly you start realizing that proteins are responsible for a lot of the regulation of everything that happens in our body. But the hypothesis here is that decreased glutamine leads to immune dysfunction and increased susceptibility to infections. And remember, one of the symptoms of overtraining syndrome is a higher precedence of upper respiratory infections. We know that when we are playing around with immune cells in petri dishes, that if we make those immune cells exercise for a long period of time, which I think is just a hilarious image, that we do see glutamine decreasing. And so there's a correlation there with immune cells in petri dishes. However, we do not actually see as much of that or a direct link in vivo, so in real bodies. So it's not, we don't necessarily see that decreased glutamine leads to decreased uptake of glutamine. We also see that if you do supplement with glutamine, it doesn't fix impaired immune cells. We see athletes with upper respiratory infections, both in high and low glutamine stakes. And we also see upper respiratory infections in athletes of all states of training, not just OTS. So, when I just talked about tone, you can kind of hear that the authors of this meta-analysis might think that the glutamine hypothesis is a little tenuous. Okay, next up, oxidative stress. So what is oxidation? Well, it's got oxygen in there. And I would point you to Collimore's great episode, What's So Radical About Oxygen? That's a really good one that talks about how we know that oxygen is obviously necessary for life, but it is a very caustic element, and especially in its version when it's showing up in the body. Oxidative stress is when the body is producing too many free radicals, and then the ratio between those free radicals and the things that we use to fight them, so antioxidants, other proteins, and our DNA, when that ratio is off, there's too many free radicals floating around in our cells, which cause cell damage. And, you could probably make a jump that, okay, muscle damage, that is probably going to lead to fatigue. That probably is a step on the way to overtraining syndrome. So we always want some oxidative stress in our body. It's how we do repair. We need some of those free radicals, but this is an issue that happens when there are too many of those free radicals. Okay, so what are the strengths of this one? We definitely see markers of oxidative stress higher in overtrained athletes. We see citrate synthase, which is a marker of your oxidative capacity. So if you have more of it, it means that you're able to deal with oxidative stress a little better. We have seen that decreases in rats that are overreached. Remember, rats, not humans, very strong experimental link between the two species, but they're rats, not humans. We need to point that out, and we need to be fair when we're talking about journals and stuff like that. So we see in rats that citrate synthase is lower, so they're more susceptible to oxidative stress. Okay, these are both helpful. Weaknesses. All the studies were really small, not a ton of relevant research, and it doesn't account for all symptoms. So this one sort of feels promising, but you can hear the authors saying more research is necessary. Okay, autonomic nervous system is our next possible hypothesis. So the hypothesis here is that a parasympathetic, which is your rest, digest, recover system, when that's going on too much, that can cause symptoms of overtraining syndromes. And now we're talking here in the sort of depressive kind of area. Reduced sympathetic activation. And so sympathetic is our fight flight response. It's a stress response, which we need when we are training and competing. You need some of that like chutzpah that comes from your sympathetic nervous system to train and race effectively. And stick with me on this one. We're getting kind of in the weeds here. So when that system is reduced because there's too much parasympathetic activation, we see sometimes that in the night, you pee out more of what are called catecholamines. And so, yeah, the term here is linked with nighttime catecholamine excretion. You're peeing these out. What are catecholamines? Okay, dopamine, adrenaline, noradrenaline. Obviously, these are hormones and signalers that are really, really important to training and racing effectively. They help trigger and regulate our sympathetic nervous system. So we don't want to pee them out in the middle of the night. And we do see this in, some times when sympathetic activation is reduced. Okay, what are the strengths here? Strengths are decreased heart rate variability when overtrained athletes are waking up, and that suggests a disruption of your autonomic nervous system. That's one of the reasons why we measure heart rate variability, is to figure out what's going on with that part of your nervous system. We also see that in some overtrained athletes, there are decreased catecholamines because maybe they've been pissing them out in the middle of the night, but here are some problems. In some other overtrained athletes, we see no differences in catecholamine concentration. The methodological differences in the studies, and this is basically the idea here is apples don't equal oranges. So the difference in the methods make it hard to compare. And then the big smoking gun here is that when we account for all of these external factors, which is one of the things that happens in studies, is that there was no discernible difference between athletes that were overtrained and normal athletes in their heart rate variability. So this is a tough one because it's like, okay, the thing that we're using to point to the autonomic nervous system dysfunction, we can't actually say that that is the thing that leads to it. So again, this is one of those where it's like the authors are probably saying more research is necessary. It doesn't account for all symptoms, and the authors probably aren't totally supportive of it. Okay, hypothalamic hypothesis. Okay, so the dysregulation of your hypothalamus and your hormonal axes may cause many symptoms of OTS. Whoa, that was a mouthful. So your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, those are three very important glands that deal with your hormones. We see that endurance athletes, that axis gets activated, and we also see that in overtrained athletes, there are marked alterations in cortisol, adrenocorticopic hormone, testosterone, and other hormones that are all regulated by this particular axis. So it might stand to reason that since endurance athletes see that activated and overtrained athletes have way too many of those particular hormones, maybe that's what's going on here. What are the weaknesses? Okay, wildly contradictory data about that activation of that axis in overtrained versus normal athletes. Basically, we've got a bunch of studies. Some say this happens. This other one says that exactly the opposite happens, and it doesn't account for all symptoms. Okay, our final hypothesis, and again, if you sat through these 15 minutes, thank you, you're the champion, is the cytokine hypothesis. Again, stick with me here. So cytokines are small signaling proteins that control and regulate inflammation, cell growth, and immune response. So remember, some inflammation is good. Don't just listen to, your yoga teacher who's trying to tell you that all inflammation needs to be gotten rid of. Some inflammation is a necessary healing response. But if there's too much inflammation, there will be too many cytokines because cytokines are what get released in order to regulate that inflammation. This can be called a cytokine storm, and that overload of these particular neurotransmitters that sort of act like hormones can cause the symptoms of overtraining syndrome. So what are the strengths of this particular hypothesis? Decreased glycogen because cytokines impair hunger, may interfere with glucose transport to make glycogen in your muscles. So that kind of goes back to one of the things we already talked about lowered glycogen. Cytokines can lower tryptophan, which can be linked to depression. Cytokines also cause decreased appetite. We already talked about that. Sleep disturbance, and those are both symptoms that are linked to overtraining syndromes. Cytokines change that hormonal pituitary axis that we talked about just a few minutes ago in undesirable ways. Lowered testosterone, too much cortisol. Those are things we already talked about. Cytokines also downregulate glutamine, which is another kind of hypothesis that we already covered. Finally, cytokines also imbalance two of our immune cells, Th lymphocytes and then Th1 lymphocytes. And what happens in this particular case is cytokines actually help too many of those Th2 lymphocytes appear and not as many Th1s. So we get some better immune system response, but the one that is worse are the Th1 lymphocytes, which fight upper respiratory infections. So in this one, you can definitely hear the authors being like, whoa, the cytokine hypothesis accounts for many of the other symptoms that we've already talked about today. But of course, they go ahead to point out that there's little direct evidence verifying increased cytokines in athletes with overtraining syndrome. So the very thing that we're like, this causes it, it doesn't always show up in athletes with overtrained syndrome. So that's obviously a big problem. There's no long-term studies. We don't have anything that really does a longitudinal study of how cytokines impair people and perhaps lead to overtraining syndrome. One study showed no change in cytokines in cyclists that are overtrained. They do go on to point out that cycling is a predominantly concentric muscular contraction, which means it's the less damaging of the two contractions between concentric and eccentric. Running is super eccentric, and that's probably a discussion for another podcast, but eccentric contractions do cause quite a bit more damage. And in those cases, because there's more damage and inflammation, we might see more cytokines. So could have been due to the fact that this particular study was only looking at cyclists. Finally, not a wide enough population. Most of the studies that looked at cytokines looked at very well-trained athletes. And in order to actually learn about this stuff, we do need to see a wider range of the population subject to these studies. Well, so that just spent about 18 minutes to tell you that we're not totally sure of where overtraining syndrome comes from. So, I'm glad that you stuck around here for that little lesson in physiology, because I do think it's important for us to know all of this. And we're going to get into why that is in just a minute. But again, thanks for sticking through that. Okay, so I just got done telling you that basically it is very, very difficult for us to actually know where overtraining syndrome comes from and what is actually causing it. And this is an opportunity for a great little sidebar here about certainty in endurance sports. Now, there's a lot of companies out there that have built their profits and their revenue on trying to tell you that certainty is possible. And so these are going to be your power meter companies, your device companies, your heart rate variability companies, your glucogen monitoring companies, basically any company out there that is trying to sell you the idea that as long as you use our product, you are going to have certainty. Lactate monitors are a great one here. Excellent tool for discovering some information. But the myth that a lot of companies try to put out there about things like lactate monitoring or power meters or stuff like that is that you are going to know without a shred of doubt exactly how hard you are supposed to go at any given time. You're going to know whether you should train or rest that day. This is like a heart rate variability monitor kind of idea here. All of these companies are basically trying to sell you an idea that you can quantify these concepts and just look at a certain number and be like, certainty achieved. And if you listened to Cody's podcast a couple weeks ago, there's this great moment when he was like, oh man, Chris, if I could put all of this into an app, I would make $1 million. And so what I want to talk about here is just the fact that certainty in endurance sports, which is basically certainty in science, every athlete is just a scientific experiment with an N of 1. There is no such thing as certainty. And that is a hard pill to swallow for a lot of athletes, because a lot of you guys want to know, like, oh, I just have to do this thing and everything is going to work out. I'm sorry, that's not the case. You can do everything right and things can still go wrong. And that's one of the beautiful things about this sport and the beautiful things about life. And that's one of the reasons why we participate in these sports. They provide a nice little microcosm for what life is like. And to illustrate this, I want to make a small detour to cramps. And cramps are things that, just bedevil endurance athletes. And I hear all the time from athletes like, okay, I really have a problem with cramping, so I'm really watching my hydration and my electrolytes. So, one of the things that we know about cramps from scientific studies is that we actually don't know what directly causes them. It's a lot like overtraining syndrome. We do know that if the muscle and the athlete is dehydrated and there's an electrolyte imbalance in that particular muscle, then yes, there is a higher probability that that athlete is going to cramp. Many other factors also influence cramping that we also see in the science. So, if a particular muscle is too weak for what you're trying to do, eventually that muscle is just going to give up. And a cramp is an involuntary muscle contraction. So, the signal from the brain just sort of just spazzes out, probably because it's getting signals back from the muscle that the muscle is exhausted and there's kind of no place for the signal to go anymore. So if you haven't done your strength training, then that's one possible cause of cramping. Another possible cause of cramping is fatigue. And you might be like, wait, didn't we just talk about fatigue? You talked about a muscle that had gotten too tired because it was weak. Yeah, absolutely. The other way that you can tire out a muscle is just by doing lots of contractions over and over again. So if your fitness isn't high enough, or if you are pacing poorly, which is basically just spending your fitness too fast, then you are also probably likely to cramp. So we've got 4 causes already. We've got dehydration, electrolyte imbalance, weakness, and fatigue. Then we can also throw in the fact that fatigue can come from if you're not sleeping very well. So you might just be tired. And then there is also a nervous system component, because we know, once again, that a cramping muscle is just a out of control contraction. So we know that something is happening to the signal between the nervous system and the muscle. And this is the reason that those spicy products like Hot Shot actually work, because what happens when you like flood your system with something spicy is you actually reset parts of your nervous system, and that can get the signal back to that muscle working again. And so even though that one seems really wild, that's a pretty good way to look at cramps. But the thing that I want you to hear here is that maybe you're dehydrated, maybe your electrolytes are low, maybe your nervous system is fatigued, maybe the muscle is too weak, maybe you've paced poorly. There's never or rarely going to be one single cause for the things that you were trying to deal with, in this particular case, cramps. But if we look at all of the studies, we can kind of like bridge them out to good behaviors in endurance sport so we can decrease our probability of getting overtrained. The first one, glycogen, you should just fuel well. The second one can be addressed by controlling intensity. We can also deal with all of this stuff with a wide array of nutritional sources and a balanced and complete diet by managing our training load effectively and not just like getting ourselves into a place where we're not getting enough rest, sleeping effectively, because we know that a lot of the symptoms come from sleep dysregulation, regular monitoring of your endocrine system. So that could be going and getting some tests done from your doctor. And then monitoring secondary sources of inflammation, so that might just be like inflammation. You might be like, oh, I'm like sort of swollen and stuff like that. But there are other indicators of inflammation in your body that you can look at. And if you hit these things, fueling well, dealing with intensity, eating well, managing the training loads, sleeping effectively, going to your doctor, watching out for signs of inflammation. I mean, these sound just like good practices for life, but definitely good practices if you're an endurance athlete. And this is one of the differences between researchers and coaches. A researcher is out there really trying to pin down and develop hypotheses that then can lead to theories. That's great. That's what they do. It's important. The advancing of human knowledge is something that we want. Coaches, on the other hand, like we don't need to know exactly what the cause is, but what we do need to know is, okay, what are the conditions in which this bad thing is less likely to happen, and controlling for that. And so once again, eat well, don't train too hard, eat a wide variety of things along with fueling your workouts, manage that training load so you're not exhausted all the time, get your rest, go to the doctor, monitor all your symptoms. If you do those things, you're probably going to have some early warning signs in place before you get to overtraining syndrome. Okay, next up, we're going to talk about diagnosis, and we're going to go into some of these gnarly case studies, which, can't wait to tell you about some of these. Okay, how can we actually tell if we end up in overtraining syndrome or non-functional overreach? And I have some bad news for you. The only like smoking gun way to determine this is through the length of the recovery that you end up going through. And so if your recovery to full training only takes like 21 days or less, it's very likely that you were under recovered. So non-functional overreach. And remember though, sometimes those symptoms can go on a little longer. So there is some wiggle room here. Maybe if it's like 4 weeks or 5 weeks, it still could be non-functional overreach, but maybe you're on the brink of getting overtraining. Remember that these things do function on a spectrum. There isn't like an off-on switch for any of them. It's not the way that your body works. But overtraining syndrome is characterized by a long recovery, so over 21 days. And after that recovery, there is no return of performance. So very different between non-functional overreach and overtraining syndrome, where non-functional overreach, you rest for 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, and you're back. Maybe you're not back to full speed and anything like that, but there's a marked return to performance. And we don't see that in overtraining syndrome. Some other ways that we can diagnose it, that you might be able to start workouts but not finish them, which that can happen to a lot of people. And then also a lack of a finishing kick. So like you can't put in anything extra at the end. You're just sort of getting more and more tired as the workout's going on. That's also something that can kind of happen all the time. You might have done a heavy strength training session the day before that takes away some of that kick. So again, just like we talked about with cramps, there's probably multiple different symptoms here that are going to point you in the direction of overtraining syndrome. Okay. But a really effective way to do it is you use something called the Profile of Mood States Questionnaire, or the POMS. And I am going to go ahead and link that in the show notes or in the down belows. And it's a fun little 65 question questionnaire. And it is going to kind of give you a score that is very subjective, but the best way I think to use it is to take this at the beginning of the season when you are hopefully not overtrained and kind of establish like, what is your mood state baseline? And then as you go through difficult parts of the year and difficult moments of training, to retake the questionnaire and see what happens. It's very similar to the kind of test you would take for depression or generalized anxiety disorder, that kind of thing, where you do a bunch of questions, you add some things up. Unlike those tests, there isn't a like, okay, if you're above this number, you have anxiety, or if you're above this number, you have this kind of depression, whether it's mild, medium, or severe. Really, the best use of the POMS is to compare it to yourself. There are a few things that like high performers tend to show a spike in the score of the positive states, the positive mood states. Kind of underperformers or average performers are kind of flat across the board. I'm kind of getting in the weeds here, but have a look at the questionnaire and the supporting material, and that will make a lot more sense. The other thing, and we talked a lot about this in the podcast with Cody, is to kind of step back and get a wider perspective of what is going on. Look at the forest of symptoms. So diet. Is your appetite off the charts, or do you have no appetite at all? Sleep. Are you sleeping effectively? Are you waking up all the time, or do you have insomnia? Sleep is a really big sign that you are not recovering effectively. Mood. If you're grumpy all the time, if you're getting into fights with your spouse, if you're getting into confrontations with people at work, if sitting in traffic is driving you insane, that is a real good sign that you are not recovering effectively. If stress load is just a lot higher than normal, because when you think about it, when you're overtrained, when you're really tired, it kind of reduces your threshold for acceptable stress. And so if it feels like you're so stressed out, it's probably because you're under recovered. And then libido. And again, Cody and I got into this and it was hilarious talking about, for both men and women, what if your libido is impaired, then that's a real sign that something's not quite right. And for men, the presence and consistency of, your morning hard on. There's just no other way to put it. So if those things, look, I'm just like giggling now. If any of those things are if any two of those things out of those five are not in the right spot, you could be on your way to non-functional overreach and possible overtraining. So, okay, recovery from it and some case studies. We've got our same guy here, Jeffrey Kreher. Again, apologies. There's a 2025 paper with co-authors Stepanek, Amreen, and Reddy. Yeah, I really urge you to go and have a look at this. It is eye-opening. But the coolest thing about it is that there are three case studies of three different athletes: one professional, one elite, and one amateur. And there's, there's just some real alarming information in here. So, ooh, stick with me. Elite level competitive mountain runner who had elite level VO2 max, and he had just completed his best ultra marathoning competitive season to date. 6 of the most competitive ultras in the world, and he landed on the podium in 4 out of the 6. He took no time off from that breakthrough season and just continued training at a high level into the next season. Yes, I'm slowing down to emphasize that this is bad. He also had a really high stress job outside of ultra running. He's putting in 20, 25 hours a week, and a few months into his new season, started experiencing heart palpitations, hyperventilation, muscle cramping, extreme fatigue, upper respiratory infections, and significant appetite swings. His first race of the year was a 50 miler, and he had to walk a chunk of it and reported extreme fatigue and lack of vigor. So, of course, what he did was he stopped training and, and saw a doctor and his coach and instantly got into a recovery program, right? Wrong. Does this sound familiar? Continued to train and entered and raced a 100-mile ultramarathon 3 months later while experiencing the same symptoms. He had to walk the final 35 miles of the race. Unsurprisingly, had a hard time recovering from that and now was experiencing chronic fatigue, malaise, sleep interruption, and depression. So he decided to reduce his training load, and that's it. Kept the intensity high, but brought the volume down a little bit. Did another 100 miler 3 months after this, and this time was so sick on course that he was forced to withdraw. Went back to the doctor. This is 6 months after the original diagnosis, and was diagnosed with non-functional overreach and overtraining syndrome. Prescribed 4 months of no running and never going above 120 beats per minute. Eventually returns to competition 15 months after the original diagnosis, and he has not been able to return to his original level of competition. That's a year and a quarter after the original diagnosis, and is a changed athlete for life. This is somebody who is standing on world podiums in his last season and just doubled down and kept going. So take a break, people. Okay, next, let's shift to an elite amateur. Ultra distance runner again. He's elite level VO2 max, but he's only training 10 to 15 hours a week versus the 20 to 25. Took a leave of absence from work because he really wanted to focus on training, and then went and did an altitude camp for 3 months at 8 to 10,000 feet above sea level. I'm guessing he was like, I want to do Leadville, so I'm going to go live in Leadville, something like that. What a classic case of like, oh, if some altitude is good and some time at altitude is good, then more must be better. We know that 6,000 to like 7,500 feet is the optimal altitude for altitude training, and that camps should be about 14 to 21 days long, not 90 days long above the optimal altitude elevation. So started getting some symptoms when he was up at altitude, and they were in accordance with altitude. So, dry mouth, coughing, dehydration, fatigue, all of that stuff. But those are things that usually show up when you go to altitude. But heart rate was depressed instead of elevated at altitude. That is a sign. Was getting 10 hours of sleep a night, but the sleep was really poor quality. Went back to sea level and experienced excessive sweating, dizziness, and heart palpitations. Had to withdraw from the next race due to extreme vertigo during the race. And those symptoms just continued to worsen. Vertigo, insomnia, migraines, cognitive fog, temperature and light sensitivity. More than a year after the initial diagnosis, experienced, quote, debilitating depression and mental despair due to symptom intensity and lack of a coherent diagnosis and corresponding loss of hope. That sounds very bad. Okay, so what'd we do? He got weekly testosterone treatments, so we're doping now and would need a therapeutic use exemption. And it's very hard to get a therapeutic use exemption for testosterone because, it's one of the smoking gun performance enhancing drugs and not one that you should really be messing around with. But he got those weekly testosterone treatments for 2 months with no improvement in symptoms. This is just a great example of how intractable overtraining syndrome can be. 2 subsequent years of false starts and relapses, and full recovery took 4 years. But in this particular case, this athlete was kind of able to return to their competitive level pre overtraining syndrome. But 4 years. Imagine being overtrained for your entire college experience. Doesn't sound great, right? Okay, case study number 3. Recreational athlete, perimenopausal, intensified her training when she decided she wanted to qualify for Boston. This was right when COVID hit. And just like a lot of athletes, all of a sudden had tons of time on her hand and just was like, I'm going to train all the time. And she did. She didn't take any rest days for, quote, several months. While training for 2 of her qualifying races, here's the laundry list of symptoms. Stress reactions in her musculoskeletal system, those are precursors to stress fractures. Hip tendinopathy, a labral tear, athletic pubalgia, that's like really uncomfortable strains in your groin region. Significant weight and muscle loss, diarrhea, intermittent mysterious chest discomfort. That should raise a red flag. But this particular athlete continued to push, did raise her caloric intake from 1,300 calories a day while training for multiple marathons to 2,000, which is still not going to cut it, and eventually gets diagnosed with overtraining syndrome and relative energy deficiency syndrome, red S. Also, yeah, we don't say eating disorder anymore because, we don't want to, like, disordered eating is not really what's going on. It's more about energy deficiency. This athlete went through 2 years of physical therapy, pain relief, steroid, and plasma-rich platelet injections, dropped volume, and no performance recovery occurred. During recovery, had symptoms of more chest infections, dizziness, fatigue, headaches, finger stiffness, brain fog, metabolic alkalosis, respiratory acidosis, and that was exacerbated by her attempt to go train at altitude, depression, and despair. My God. So there's some unifying traits of these athletes that you might recognize perhaps in yourself. Often continued to push in their training and racing despite very clear signals that they should stop and they should rest. Some obsessive compulsive traits, some denial traits, which are also traits and symptoms we associate with addiction. Yeah. If you know athletes like this, if you are not an athlete like this yourself, this kind of obsessive training peaks has to be 100% green. If I do everything, I'm going to have success. It's a very rigid, inflexible, and fragile way of approaching your training. And very often those athletes who hold on so tightly and just keep training and never rest, they're the ones who end up broken, not having success. The best athletes understand how to stress their body and then recover from the training that they're doing in order to actually improve. And so if you know somebody like this, remember, it's very unlikely you're going to be able to change them. But offer some support, just check in on them, see how they're doing, be a friend, be an ally, all sorts of those things. And if you see some of these traits in yourself, please talk to a coach, talk to a mental health professional, talk to a doctor, talk to somebody who's gone through this, because here's the return to competition protocol. So phase 1, which lasts at least 12 weeks, full stop cardiovascular activity, 3 or fewer days of walking, maybe some light cycling or swimming, but with no increase in heart rate. This phase can go on from 8 weeks up to 2 years if symptoms don't resolve. But if you make it 12 weeks and your symptoms don't recover, you can move into phase 2. So this is 4 or fewer days a week. Heart rate's got to be below 120 or below 60% of your max heart rate, whichever is lower, and RPE of like 4 to 6, so moderate to moderately hard. You can start running again a little bit. Walking, swimming, cycling continue. Hiking is great. resistance training, but only with bands, not with weights. And if you can build up to 75 to 80% of your pre-diagnosis volume with no intensity, you're not allowed to add intensity in this phase, you can move on to phase 3. If any symptoms of OTS return, you got to go back to phase 1. So the timeline here is hard to assess, but the thing that allows you to move on is if you can get to 75 to 80% of pre-diagnosis volume with no intensity. Just going to keep saying it because, endurance athletes are crazy. You're allowed to go on to phase 3. Okay, phase 3. You can return some intensity to your program, but only in very small doses, and only after you get up to 95 to 100% of your pre-diagnosis volume, without symptoms returning and without intensity. If you're able to build up to that volume without symptoms coming back and not adding in any intensity, you can add at first 1 session that includes a little intensity at 7 to 8 out of 10, so hard to very hard, and then building up to 2. So the total volume, if you're only at 1 workout, should only be 5% of your total volume. And that's for the workout, not for the intensity time. And then if you add a second one, maybe that creeps up to 10% of total training time for your training volume. Watch your heart rate and see how your body responds. Hiking is really good during this phase because it allows you to add some strength without a ton of intensity. Don't go to altitude. Don't do any heat training. We want to avoid anything that adds stress that we can't really account for. If you're able to do this, then you are allowed to return to regular training. So that's the return to training protocol. It's pretty gnarly. It will be outlined in the down belows. Okay, well, we have come to the end, and I hope that what you're taking away from this episode is that overtraining syndrome is very bad and can take a very long time to recover from. In some cases, it can end your endurance career. That would obviously not be great. And then I also really hope that what you're taking away from today is that non-functional overreach, NFO, is a step on the way to overtraining syndrome. So good coaching and good self-coaching requires functional overreach, FO. And again, I'm going to point you in the direction of our progressive overload episode. You need to do functional overreach. You also need to have a really healthy reason for participating in your sport in the first place. If your reason for participating in sport is extrinsic, like it's something about your ego or it's something that's going to get, that is one of the conditions where we see this kind of obsessive attitude coming in, like I need to do this because it shores up my identity in some way. I've been there. A lot of athletes I know have been there. I get it. You also need to listen to your body, and really be like, is this fatigue the right amount of fatigue, or do I know that it's actually pretty bad? The ability to be flexible in your training and not just be like, I'm going to do everything no matter what. And that requires a growth mindset. A lot of the times these obsessive athletes have a very fixed mindset, which is weird because they're working really hard, but they believe actually nothing is ever going to change. And that's, obviously counterintuitive. Growth mindset's really important. Self-compassion, being able to take a break and not beat yourself up about it. And then also a really healthy amount of self-worth. Again, this is kind of linked to what I was just talking about extrinsic motivation, but if you get all of your self-worth from your racing results, you are setting yourself up for some real problems and probably an exit from the sport because you're doing it kind of for the wrong reasons. Validation, success, affirmation, humans need it and we love it, but it can't be 100% of the reason why you're doing something. Maybe 10 to 20% of ooh, it'd be really nice to stand on a podium. That would feel good. Be really nice to win some money at this race. Be really nice to, move up, win my age group, get to Kona. All of those things are important. And we're going to talk more in the coming year about how we can look at those outcome goals and then step away from them so we can actually get to some healthier approaches to training and racing. But very often, and I hope you saw this in the case studies part, that what drives us to OTS is this inability to stop. It's basically a lot more like an addiction than a healthy approach to sport. And so, if you're displaying some of those tendencies, then I really urge you to get help. Your coach is a good place to start, but it's unlikely your coach is a mental health professional. And they will probably be like, ooh, okay, I can offer you some support, but I think you should also go see, a mental health specialist or something like that, a sports psychologist or a therapist or a psychiatrist, something like that. Somebody who can really sit down with you and talk through some of these reasons, somebody who's qualified to do that. Well, I hope this was an illuminating visit to the infirmary. It might have been a scary one. If you like this episode and you found it valuable and you know somebody who might benefit from listening to it, please share the podcast with somebody else. It is the best way that you can support the show and support what we're doing at Campfire. And then if you want to support us in a more direct way, I've got one spot left for 2026 coaching. And we got about 3 spots left for Bend Camp. And so if you're interested in those, there are going to be links to both of those in the show notes below. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you're feeling better.